and welcome to 31 Days of Terror 2023, day number 3. And I have 2 spooky stories for you today, and story number 1 comes from Charlotte. A few years ago, I would often stay in Airbnbs. This was around the gold mining town of Ballarat, regional Victoria in Australia. The first time I stayed at the house with the red door, I felt a few cold vibes in the house, particularly the bathroom. I was mostly hanging out in the beautiful gardens outside. Fountains, foliage and cool artwork were all around. I slept that night with the door closed as I had a strange feeling about the living room that led out of the bedroom. Even in the room, I shut my eyes tight as I felt like there was somebody else there. I was going through a tough time relationship-wise and needed a place to stay. The next time I stayed there was a bit more creepy. I was outside mostly and came in to use the bathroom, and as I walked into the dining area near the kitchen, something rushed with small steps under my right side. I had one of those long Uniqlo puffer jackets on and heard the footsteps run under the dining table. Small footsteps, a child or a cat, I'd thought. I didn't see a thing and immediately looked under the dining table, but absolutely nothing was there. I had goosebumps all over as I definitely felt and heard something. I messaged the owners to ask if they wanted me to feed their cat, as I was convinced there was something. They replied the same evening that they didn't have a cat, and it was very strange indeed. I didn't book to stay there again. We had moved to regional Victoria for my partner at the time's work. We lived in town but always wanted a farm property. On an autumn day, a place randomly popped up on Facebook, and in September we checked it out. An old cedar wood house. It wasn't that old really, late 1970s. I felt happy about it as no one had potentially died in it. However, it was next to an old gold mine which ran its tunnels all under and around the 15-acre property. Lots of miners died working in those days. Side note, there were a bunch of rocks in the middle of the paddocks where wild irises grew, and we figured this was the spot of an old miner's cottage. Funny that it was an Irish couple who built the place for their family, with all European trees. And turns out once we were looking around the place to potentially buy it, it was owned by a friend of ours and his Irish wife, who bought it after them. I loved this as my grandma is Irish and I'm from the UK. Anyway, I digress. We later found out that the son of the original family had passed away. Not long after this, and moving in, odd things would happen. I kept finding coins in odd places, not where my partner at the time had shoved stuff in the wash. I had an eerie feeling in the hallway that led to the bedrooms. One night I was up feeding our 5-month-old and the bedroom door flung open. I was expecting to see someone there, but nobody was there. I expected to see my partner, but when I looked beside me, he was right there next to me. The door would randomly open, and it wasn't on a slant and didn't make sense how it could open by itself. I didn't understand about lucid dreams until listening to your podcast, but one night I vividly dreamt of things flying around in the hallway. I physically woke up feeling terrified, like I was awake and having to get my son out of bed. I was possibly tired and sleep deprived, but it felt so real. I felt like he wasn't safe. My son's room was deathly cold, and always saw orbs flying around on the baby monitor. I put it down to dust. But looking back, it was too fast for dust. Fast forward a few years, it was my time to move out. Little creepy things stopped happening as I had cleansed the house. The day I moved out, my friend said to me about the house that she didn't want to tell me at the time, and that there was a woman standing over the butcher's sink. At first she thought it was me, but she disappeared. The only other things I could feel were like the TVs had come on, but when I checked they hadn't, and both TVs would be unplugged. The closest house to me was 1 kilometre away. About 15 years ago, my girlfriends from work invited me to a psychic night at the local RSL. I didn't think much of it and didn't really know what it would entail. There were 2 mediums there, and they started to connect to people's past loved ones in the audience. I half-jokingly said to my friends that the only people I knew at the time that had passed away were my granddads on either side. There was one family who spoke of their son who was an electrician. He would switch lights on and off in their home, at which point a whole light fitting flew down from the ceiling. There was no way of setting it up. You couldn't have pushed the light from inside the roof, and the mediums would have had no idea who they'd be talking to that night. It was time for the next person, and the medium said that he was getting F and an S. I was thinking that's my granddad. When nobody put their hand up, I did. My granddad's name was Fred Shaw. They told me how he had died from bowel cancer, and that he was young for a granddad. He was 64 when he passed. They got that he taught me how to draw horses and a few other things that I wrote down. They said that he liked fried eggs, not boiled. The next day I called my mum to check. "Mum, what type of eggs did Grandad like?" And she said, "Oh, definitely fried, not boiled." And I've never felt goosebumps like it. I was so grateful that he said hello. Oh, we love a story of a loved one coming back to say hello. And those medium events, those psychic medium events, I just never know what to make of them. Like I said before, I do think some of it is just hit and miss, where they're just throwing out random sayings into the audience and hoping that someone picks up on it. But other times things are so specific that I just feel like it just feels weird to me, And I will say, Charlotte, that going back to your first story about the Airbnb gave me the absolute heaves. It reminded me of when I was in secondary school, and my friend came into school one day, and her and her brother had been home alone, and they decided to hide behind the curtains of the French doors to frighten their parents when they came in. And they were standing looking out the French doors into the darkness, and something small and humanoid ran past the window and scared the living bejesus out of them. And your story about whatever it was running under the table just reminded me of that. Don't they say as well that finding coins randomly is like a gift from the other side, from the dead, supposedly? I think in the line of ways in which loved ones can communicate with you after they're dead, or even just the dead can communicate with you after you're dead, leaving coins, it's a pretty good one. I'll accept that one. And story number 2 comes from Sara. Sometimes I just know things. I can't explain how, but I just know things. When I was younger, my mum and dad divorced. My mum met someone else and he became my dad. My family felt complete again, and I felt safe knowing he was around. He was really into his music, and we always had music in the car or playing at home. Years later they separated, but we still had a really close bond. He worked away and wasn't home often. One day I bumped into him in my local supermarket and he was chatting away, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something was wrong. He was ill. I went home and messaged my mum. I told her that I'd bumped into him and that I know he's ill. I got the feeling that it was something to do with his head. Weeks later, my mum called me to tell me that my stepdad had been away working and had collapsed. He had a terminal brain tumour. I was distraught. I visited him, but he wasn't the same man I knew anymore. He passed over to the other side a month later. The church was full and people were standing outside. He was so popular. I was in pain and grief. Every day I would hear a song that he used to listen to. I could feel his energy around. I struggled to cope with the pain. One night I was dreaming. In my dream I was walking back from my stepdad's funeral. I started to walk past this house and he was in the garden. I said, "I'm just coming back from your funeral." He said, "I know, but I have to tell you that I can't see you every day anymore." I said, "I love you," and he said, "I love you too, but you have to walk on past now." I woke up from my dream in tears. It was so real. The next day I felt like the pain had been taken away and that he had moved to the other side. Oh, that is a very painful story. And I don't know what you would do with that gift. I feel like it's simultaneously a blessing and a curse, which feels like a really cliched thing to say, but I do mean it. I don't know how you process the information, knowing somebody is standing looking at somebody that you love and thinking you're sick, and I know that you're sick, and I don't know what to do with this, and then to go on and lose that person. But those visitation dreams, as I like to call them, I think they're so powerful and they give so many people closure. And they just fill my heart with joy, because it's so nice to hear people's stories and for them to be able to say, I felt like my loved one came to me in a dream and I felt like it was really them. That's so important. Thank you so much for listening to day 3 of 31 Days of Terror 2023. Thank you to Charlotte and Sara for sending in your stories. Remember, if you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That's patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you tomorrow.